I am very, very pleased to introduce John Richardson, whom I've met as an external lecturer on the MSc. John is a filmmaker whose work found direction after his own life-altering encounter with mental health services. And after collaborating with charities, public health organizations, and mental health trusts, hear how he tries to navigate a space to exist between authentic art and corporate pabulum. John, you'll have to pronounce that for me. I've heard John talk before, and I know he will give us a wonderful talk. Thank you, John.
Cheers. Okay, I'm going to do the share screen thing. Now do the customary, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my encounters with the mental health system and trying to make films with them, essentially. And I'm going to start off.
John,
yeah.
Could
Can you hear me?
Speak slightly louder? I think
Let me turn my mic up.
And is there any way you could make it full screen, just so we can see the full screen? I think it might be a bit tricky, but
I don't know where
view and then full screen. So we don't see any of your links.
I don't think I can.
Oh, don't worry, that's fine. That's cool.
Okay, so I'm just going to start showing you this little clip here. So I thought maybe by showing you this, the talk will feel just as exciting as this little animation I made. So bear with me. So a little bit about what I do. So I'm a filmmaker. I run a video production company called Mindwick, and we specialize in mental health related content. And most of our work is with NHS trusts and public health organizations and charities. And we do a little bit of independent filmmaking as well. And I do this podcast called Coffee and Psychosis, which has got nothing to do with coffee. And it's kind of a space where I get to talk to other people who've been through this thing called psychosis in a more kind of everyday conversation kind of way, which I don't think we get enough spaces to have those types of conversations in a safe way. And I also do a bunch of mental health related stuff, which is hard to define. So on an individual level, where I try and use my experiences and the skills I have to hopefully make the world a little nicer than how I found it for people like me. Because I feel quite strongly that we need a more compassionate and a more rights-based and less hierarchical mental health system. So filmmaking drove me mad. That's a pretty neat and tidy way of putting it. Of course, there's a millions of reasons why something like that can happen, but that's what I'm leading with today. So I'd known I'd wanted to be a filmmaker since I was very young. Lucky for me, I was at university studying film production, and the course wasn't really working out for me. And over the summer, I went through this thing that people like to call psychosis. And what that looked like for me was this kind of incredible energy, feeling invincible, having lots of big ideas, not really caring what anyone thought anymore, speaking really fast, euphoria, liberation. It felt like I'd kind of found myself in a way, and like I'd discovered the secret truth of the universe that I wanted to tell everyone about. And during that time, I'd write all these prophetic phrases all over my arms, and I'd talk into my dictaphone. I'd film lots of weird things, thinking it was feeding into my own kind of theology. And I'd arrange things into what looked like a mess to most people, but to me, it was wrapped up in all this meaning. Eventually, I edited that footage into something for my coursework because I decided I wanted to drop out. There's a couple of little clips there from it. So I had this screening ceremony on my course where I had to stand up in front of my class and all the lecturers and say, "Oh, hello, my name's John. This is a film about me losing my mind in the summer. And you all know the sound of crickets." Well, and you can imagine how that went down. And yeah, there's a beef burger going into a DVD tray there. It's art, I guess. What can I say? And the camera I filmed all that stuff on actually ended up in police evidence. I guess they had to kind of check that I hadn't murdered anyone or something like that. But I do love the idea that someone had to watch through all that footage for that reason, when in another universe, they might have gone through it and maybe learned a bit about what I was going through rather than relying on pathology, I suppose. And that whole state of mind for me, I was thinking a lot about how metaphor is only allowed to exist in certain spaces, and art in itself is really quite confined. One of my favorite definitions of psychosis is the death of metaphor, because to me, this thing we call psychosis is just an incredibly creative coping mechanism in a way. And I don't mean to kind of romanticize distress by that. It's just a feeling I had that it was okay to use imagination in filmmaking, but in life you have to play by the rules of what's normal. Otherwise people think you're crazy. So somewhere in the middle of all that, I had this standoff that resulted in me getting dragged into a hospital by the police because I couldn't convince them I wasn't crazy, which wasn't much fun. It was really quite dehumanizing and degrading in lots of ways. And up until then, for the most part, I'd had a great time other than scaring my friends away. It was only when I encountered these mental health people that things got kind of bad for me. And there are a few nice people and members of staff in the hospital, but for the most part, I was really like, to hell with these guys. They're all part of this system that's kept me as a prisoner, and they think there's something wrong with me. They order me around and judge me. They play all these weird kind of power games, and they act like this is supposed to be helpful. The way a lot of the staff there would talk to me is that they knew more about me than I did. They were the expert of me, and they made the hoops and I had to jump through them. And that just goes against everything I'm about. When I got out of hospital and the mental health team would come to the house I was staying in, I'd just jump out the window and run away. I didn't want anything to do with them. This whole encounter made me not able to trust them because ultimately I felt like they'd hurt me. And eventually I ended up moving home with no real motivation to do anything. So I quit university and I felt like all my dreams had kind of evaporated, and I sunk quite low, so low that I had to go crawling back and contact mental health services for some help. But anyway, these new guys, they actually treated me like a human being and they helped me a lot in the end. One of the best things they did to help me was they asked me if I wanted to make a film about psychosis and early intervention services, which was the service I was under the care of at the time. And I didn't really have much else to do, so I went for it. And yeah, nothing motivates like success. So the film I made was called Simon Says Psychosis, and it caught way more attention than I expected, or anyone expected. And it's more or less a kind of glorified advert for a mental health system, mental health service, disguised as a documentary about young people's experiences of psychosis. And who would have known that just a year earlier, I wanted nothing to do with the mental health system. And now I'm making a film that makes them look really great. And we had lots of attention on social media. BBC News interviewed me for the website, which was fun. We ended up with about 50,000 views altogether, which is quite scary. My favorite part of all that was, for a couple of weeks, if you search Jesus on the BBC News website, the film was the first result. So I wouldn't be completely lying if I said the film was bigger than Jesus, at least for a certain amount of time. And then, although I look at the film now, I kind of just see the bits I could do better. The film really helped me in that it reminded me that I can make an impact with people through film, and it gave me a lot of my confidence back. And at that point, I had kind of fallen out of love with making films, which is hard for me because it was the only thing I was really good at, and the only thing I really wanted to do. But this film gave me a lot of my confidence back, and now I had a lot of new opportunities, and you can trace back all the work I've done directly to that film. And this was the start of me thinking about the ethics of work like this. So I'll always remember this gigantic rant of a YouTube comment on the video. It was over 2,000 words long, and the guy went into some serious detail analyzing all of us in the film and saying what was wrong with us and how we came to be there and how we didn't understand what was going on for us. And that one of the people in the film, she said in it that medication helped her. And this guy in the comment section, he was saying, oh, we both must be working for a pharmaceutical company or something, which was a bit weird, but hey ho. So I started getting involved with a bunch of video projects around mental health with NHS trusts and charities, and I'm going into this wanting to kind of get people's stories out, wanting to change the world like we all do. Because I think whether you're a filmmaker or a plumber or a sculptor or whatever it might be, you probably do your best work when it's something you believe in and when the project is something that allows you to practice the values that you hold. And that is how I want to approach my work. I want to expose people to new ideas and unheard stories, and I want to make them angry about what I'm angry about. I want them to laugh at what I think is ridiculous. I want to move them to tears by the things that sadden me. And I want to focus on the things that affect me and my friends and my community and my world ultimately. And I really believe that film and art more generally, it provides us with a type of empathy that you can't really find anywhere else. And I know I process the intricacies of existence a lot better through art than by, say, learning about the arrangement of the molecules. But all that kind of thinking can quickly go out the window when you need to earn a living, which the idealist in me is still coming to terms with how to navigate. So we started getting really busy and getting lots of commissions for all kinds of corporate videos and co-production projects and recruitment films and so on. And the clients we work with, they often love that I'm a former service user, because then they can kind of tick 2 boxes at once. But because this is my life and my occupation, I also bring a sensitivity to the work that other people without that experience might not. And I learned quite quickly that a lot of what people in the mental health world become aware of me through is my personal projects, which are a lot different to the kind of work I do for money. But that's not the kind of video they're going to pay me to make. So I get paid to show off my clients' values and what their organization thinks about mental health, which may differ from mine. And obviously I always do better when our values overlap. But sometimes that's something you can't know until it's too late. Because filmmaking, I think, and documentary more specifically, is quite exploitative in its very nature, in that there's always an observer and a subject, which is similar to certain dynamics in mental health. And I find myself in a lot of ethical dilemmas because of that, such as consenting to interviews. So we were commissioned to make a video to promote a hospital, and they think it's a good idea to interview some of the patients. So they can sign a consent form to say they're happy to be interviewed, but at the same time, they've been judged to not have capacity and have to be held there under section. And there's this kind of paternalism that says, like, no, you shouldn't be allowed to speak. You're not in the kind of right frame of mind to do this. We're taking that decision out of your hands. And then on the other hand, who am I to say whether someone can decide what's right for them and whether it's okay to do that? It's hard to know. And some of the people we interviewed for that, they were asked by the staff there, like, what do you like about being here? And some of them reply, like, I hate it here. I feel like a prisoner. And I'd have probably said the same thing if I was in their shoes. And another project, it was this kind of experience-based co-design project. So I was asked to interview people who'd stayed on a specific psychiatric ward about what they think needs changing. And the staff on the ward are meant to collaboratively reflect on this and improve things as a result of watching this film and hearing the testimony of people who stayed on their ward under their care. And people obviously said a lot of hard things for staff to hear that they'd never been able to express before, because they'd never been given that time and that kind of safe space to do it. And that kind of stuff can really split people from the staff point of view. So some of the staff were really humbled by it. But the manager of the ward ended up writing me a really, really grouchy email. Like, you've just chosen all the bad parts. Where's all the nice things people said? So I gave him the transcripts of all the interviews, this big, like, couple of inches thick stack of paper. And I said, you tell me where all the positive bits. And he had to come around in the end, to his credit, because there wasn't that much positive stuff that people said. And because I have to embrace my own mental health issues as being out there on the internet, and it's not something that I can hide whether I like it or not, it becomes my unique selling point in a way. So people that hire us, they often know about my experiences already. And there's been times when I've been asked stuff by clients like, are you taking your medication? Which just kind of echoes so much of the paternalism that I hated about being in hospital. And these kind of dilemmas end up making me feel really quite isolated with them. And although I work in a team, these concerns are quite unique to me because I occupy a quite strange space between these two worlds of making films and being someone who's had mental health problems. Like we were hired to film these training videos where we used actors to play out scenarios around suicide to train staff about how to kind of respond to things in that situation. And that was really quite weird for me because someone like myself who's been living with suicidal thoughts for a long time and has acted on them before, seeing all these scenarios play out before me was quite surreal, especially when I eventually I recognized the part of the hospital we filmed this stuff in, which was this weird half-closed hospital. And I recognized it because that was one of the places I was actually sectioned in, which was quite strange. And one particular project really shifted my approach to what I do. It was this film I did in partnership with a mental health trust called Medicating Me. And the film was meant to be used to open up conversations about taking medication, because it's conversations that not really given the chance to flourish. I think the discourse around medication is quite black and white. It's often about whether it works and whether it doesn't work, and there's this huge gray area in between that gets lost. So the film was me interviewing people about their own experiences of what medication meant to them, the kind of internal conflicts they had around it, and how it impacted their identity. And the people I spoke to, they were really generous and open and honest, and I wanted to do it because I think the way that most of us who take medication probably think a lot more about it than the people that prescribe it. And a lot of the conversations are quite entrenched and polarized, and it can be like a war between psychology and psychiatry. And we kind of just get left out of that conversation in many ways. So anyway, I finished the film and we're asked to show it to the board of this trust, all these kind of suits. I'm in the belly of the beast now, all these executives and so on. And a lot of them, they loved it, which was great. But there were some dissenting voices who wanted me to re-edit it. They thought there was too much negative stuff in there, whatever that means. And some of them even thought it was too dangerous to release, which was really sad for me. because I just wanted to do these people's truths justice. And there's a lot more dangerous things on the internet, like Netflix. And I was also told the film was anti-psychiatry, which was really quite frustrating because I'd gone to quite a lot of effort to try and make it as balanced as possible. And often the term anti-psychiatry is kind of used to shut down conversations a lot, when, if anything, I'm not anti-psychiatry, I'm just pro-good psychiatry. So I'm constantly trying to reconcile what feels quite inconsolable. I want to challenge the culture of mental health. And in a lot of ways, I know I can make a difference having one foot in and one foot out of the system, which can often feel like standing on two bits of ice drifting away from each other. But oh well. I think that's it. Have I not used up enough time?
Thank you. No, John, I mean, if you finished, thank you so much. Sorry, I'll just start my video again. Thank you very much.
I think I spoke quicker than I normally do. I've had a lot of coffee.
Well, we have questions, and we haven't been able to run through all the questions previously with speakers, so it's quite good that we have a long time for questions.
Yes, quick fire round.
So I'll pass it on to Louise to ask the questions that come up in the chat, and then if we have time, there will be more for discussion, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Hi there, John.
Hiya.
Thank you so much for what you shared there. And we've got a few questions here. I'm going to jump around some of them, but I'm just going to start with this one from Bethan Illman. And she says, I'm wondering how you experience the process of making these documentaries. Is it ever triggering or cathartic or reflective? Or do you view them as something separate and just work?
Some of them I definitely have to think of as just work. I know, like, a lot of really famous old artists, they would do kind of secret work where they painted portraits for these rich people so they could support the work they actually cared about. And that's kind of how I think about it a lot of the time. But in answer to the first part of that question, it's all three of those things. Like, editing is quite an emotional process for me if the work is something if it's moving, just looking at people's stories, and I'm often kind of found crying at the computer, just having to rewatch over and over again. And there's things that I'll leave out of the film that touched me, and it's a shame I can't put everything in the film in a way. But it's definitely cathartic.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So it's sort of a really deep kind of process for you.
Yeah.
We've got another question. It's on the topic that I also was really interested in. Could you expand on your ideas about psychosis being the death of metaphor? And what are your thoughts on the link between anxiety, neuroticism, neurosis, fear, and creativity? That's two quite different questions, perhaps.
Yeah, so the death of metaphor, it's hard to explain, because when I heard someone say that, it just clicked to me, because that just encapsulated what it was for me, that normally metaphors are something that we use on purpose, that we know is not real, that it doesn't make sense. But when you're in that sort of mind state, that kind of barrier between the real world and the world you're in, it gets destroyed, and all these metaphors become reality. So you join all these things together that doesn't make sense to anyone. It's no longer a metaphor, it's real to you. I think that.
Yeah, no, that's
like
really
that.
helpful.
It's
Yeah,
hard to articulate, I think.
No, that's really helpful. And that's the sort of second part of that question was your thoughts on the link between anxiety, neuroticism, neurosis, fear, and creativity. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think I know I've spoken to a lot of people that do creative stuff, and one thing a lot of them have in common is we're kind of full of existential dread in a way. So I think making stuff, producing stuff is kind of a way of trying to not necessarily like leave a legacy, but hope that something lives on after you die. And definitely motivated a lot by anxiety, definitely. And I guess what Neurosis is like the everyday lower version of Psychosis, isn't it? Is that right?
Well, neurosis is often when you're aware of the thoughts that you're having, that they may be intrusive and not helpful, whereas psychosis, you might lose that insight.
Yeah. So I think
that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't think I've got that much to say about that.
I just wanted to say it links with what John was saying a minute ago, that the metaphor is sort of held on to in neurosis and sort of lost perhaps in psychosis. I think that's what he was saying.
Okay.
And here's another lovely comment. It's not actually a question, but maybe you want to reflect on it. It says, love your courage. This is from, sorry, I haven't been saying people's names. This is from Mirabai Swingler. Love your courage, John, in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, it's quite scary. Definitely. I've ended up in a lot of places that I didn't think I'd ever be allowed in. Like there was one instance where I was filming on a ward, and there was a student nurse who it was his first time ever on a psychiatric ward, and I was in the office, and he must have not realized that I should have been on the other side of the glass in another circumstance. And I was like, oh, how are you finding it? And he's like, well, one of those guys, the way he looked at me gave me chills. So, oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. So there's sort of those two sides of the glass there.
Yeah.
Actually, and that sort of brings me on to comment from Clive Sherlock, who says, we are critical psychiatrists and very much with you.
Oh, that's nice to know. Yeah, there's a lot of good. I think psychiatry gets a bad rap, but a lot of the most inspiring people working in mental health I've come across are psychiatrists, for sure.
Definitely. And here's one about this kind of resistance that you were describing. So this is from Rebecca Gruff. Do you think a lot of the resistance towards your film that you experienced with the board was because in reality they know this is reality, but it's overwhelming? So the resistance does not come from a bad place, but a place in which they don't know how to deal with the reality that many people live through difficulties within their mind and soul.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot of ways in which patients or service users or whatever you like to call us, we interact with mental health professionals, and there's a lot of tools they have to kind of stop having difficult conversations, like the whole, how is your mood on a scale of 1 to 10? It's just a way of shutting down a deeper, more difficult conversation. So I might say I feel blue rather than 5, something like that. And they think I'm a bit crazy because I don't understand the question or something, but the question doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Here's kind of another word of encouragement, really. It's from Ava, and she says, John, it's voices like yours that give me hope that there will one day be a positive change for all. I just wish my husband was here to watch your most moving presentation.
Yeah, thanks. That's very touching.
So other questions. So this is from Ruby Maddock. John, do you find that the rejection of the experience of those with mental health conditions or experience psychosis by mental health and medical professionals is common?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's, I've got a lot to say about that. Yeah, there's definitely a kind of barrier, or like a closed group. Like if you think about something like peer support and how that fits in with multidisciplinary teams, then it's a really hard job to do because it's not traditional, and a lot of the way that mental health works is following on from really old traditions, and like the psychiatrist is the one in charge, and a peer support worker can be very disempowered by a lot of those dynamics, and it's really hard, especially because they're often the one who's paid the least, so you're already saying they're valued the least. And I think maybe in some teams people can end up resenting peer support workers because they feel like they haven't had to get any qualifications or like that kind of thing. And there's definitely a question about like ownership and who gets to say what is the truth and what should be done. And at the moment we've got a mental health system where it's very top down, and the people who experience these things, their views aren't respected properly. There's a lot of tokenism which pays lip service to it, a lot of virtue signaling and stuff like that, when really I like to see lived experience put in the center of understanding, and then we can start working out from there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember someone who was working in the arts describing her previous experience with psychosis as it kind of, for the professionals, it was, did she have, hallucinated? Was it a psychosis tic, yes or no? Whereas for her, the actual psychosis was meaningful, but wasn't given space. But that brings me to this next question from Cara Coyle, who's asking about labels. So, how do you deal with labels you've been given?
I just try and ignore them. I think I know a lot of people find it really helpful, and I'm not one to say like, oh, you shouldn't think of yourself like that. I think we all want to do what works for us. It's just when we're not given a choice of how we look at ourselves, and we're not so many systems and procedures and protocols in the mental health system prohibit us from being able to own our own identities and decide what things mean for us. And just the term mental health problem. So this psychosis thing for me, it wasn't a good thing or a bad thing. It was something that I feel like I'd need 10 mouths to talk about properly at the same time. Because it wasn't just as simple as being a problem. And so many of the meetings you have with mental health professionals, they want to concentrate on like the problem. So like, let's talk about all the shit things in your life and that sort of thing. And that doesn't really particularly make you feel great. And I'd rather have people try and focus on the strengths and resourcefulness of people who go through these things. Definitely,
which sort of chimes in with our last presentation as well. I completely agree with that. And so this is interesting from Alice. I wonder what you think about this. She talks about not ascribing to dividing line between those with lived experience and others. So she says, when people mentioned wanting to edit changes to your material, perhaps it touched on their realities. Would you agree that we all have lived experience of mental health? The only divide is between those who admit it.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like for a start, like the whole term lived experience I have trouble with, because I don't know what like death experience is. Like all experiences lived in some way or another. But the idea that there's these mental health professionals that are all beacons of sanity, and then there's us who are the opposite, is just quite ridiculous. To think that we're not all affected by life in ways you can call mental health issues is possibly one of the biggest illusions that persists in the mental health system. And if I meet a mental health professional and they've been through something similar or whatever it might be, I want to know, because it makes me trust them more. If they're able to show their own vulnerabilities and relate to me in a kind of common ground way, that's going to save a lot of time.
It's that kind of shared humanity, isn't it?
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, just now amongst medical students, there's a burnout epidemic and more kind of mental health stuff going on than issues than there has ever been recorded previously. So there is definitely Yeah, there's a lot going on there. But and actually, this is from one of our medical students, Nabila Mayat. She writes, she's got a question for you. In terms of being cathartic, have you found that as time goes on and you discuss and explore the emotions of your experience more and more through your filmmaking and talking, have the emotions decreased in power? Do they always feel just as intense as it was to experience?
It's hard to know. But yeah, I've definitely, I've got a very ingrained, I guess, yearning for justice in some way, not just for myself, but for people that aren't around and aren't able to talk about it and have platforms. And I think, yeah, I've still got that kind of deep burning sense of wanting justice and a new way of doing things that'll never kind of go away. And I think that's just kind of who I am, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And here, sort of talking about sort of kind of following on from that, but this is a question about from I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Ceci Egan. I hope I got your name right. I think from my own thoughts and discussions with other service users, it can be difficult to feel projects builders' collaborations with mental health services are willing to go beyond lip service or tokenism. I wonder if, as well as the many projects that seek to have a service user participation, in inverted commas, if we, as those with lived experience, need space for autonomous projects and access to funding away from what we can often feel like an inescapable power dynamic.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely agree with that. The idea of co-production is quite a lofty height to aspire to for mental health services. I think charities in the third sector are in a much better position to do it because there's so much red tape and bureaucracy within the NHS. And they often say they're like, the NHS is 10 years behind, so they've only just discovered social media when we've all been on it for a decade and that sort of thing, and they're really reluctant to take risks with what they put out there. And it's a very risk averse culture, not completely in a bad way, but it often stops things from happening.
And actually, just hearing back from Clive Sherlock, I love this comment. John, that's brilliant. Blue rather than 5 says so much more. And then Viv responds, yes, blue, indigo blue, deep blue make more sense to me too. That's lovely.
Definitely, yeah.
Interestingly, as we're talking, more and more questions are coming in and more messages. It's sort of exponentially growing as we go along. So I hope, Maria, you're keeping time, but I'll carry on because there seems to be so much people want to say. Okay, here's another one. Perhaps we've touched on this really. This is from Ali and talking about the mental health system being reductionist with our DSM and ICD, the symptoms, disorder, diagnosis, treatment. I think many robotic method of treating is related to this training and staff believing these categories are real and following the script and not questioning whether fundamentally these categories are effective, particularly long term.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think it's a lot about division in the way that the mental health system's constructed, and whether it's through like a title like doctor or a uniform, there's a kind of barrier between us as the people sectioned or using mental health services or whatever, and the people who are treating us. Say that question again. I lost my train of thought.
Well, actually, we've sort of addressed it a little bit, but it's sort of about categorizing people with mental health into symptoms and disorder and diagnosis.
So I think that a lot of that's about like just humans want to understand things. We're afraid of things we don't understand. And I think there's still a huge amount of people call it stigma, but it's prejudice and discrimination against people who go through these things. And I think a lot of the sort of DSM stuff, possibly, I think they want to try and use it as a way to hope people can understand more about these things and experiences in a really neat and tidy way. But life isn't that neat and tidy, especially when you're dealing with something as complicated as not just someone's brain, but their whole existence.
For sure. And my experience as a GP is often it seems to me that it's more important what's almost happened to people than, you know, the responses may be varied, but that they're not maybe the most important thing, you know, whether it's depression or anxiety, or, you know, this perhaps the story that's going on behind that might be more important than the actual diagnosis in terms of moving forward. But it's just moving to something else. This is from Ranjita Dittal, who is a pharmacist who I have enjoyed working with. And I see she's very engaged in the arts. And she writes, John, what would have made conversations about medicines helpful for you? You say current conversations are very polarized. And she says, I'm a pharmacist, researcher, and sculptor.
Okay, yeah. So I think for a start, transparency goes a long way. So it means a lot for a doctor or a pharmacist to say, oh, we don't know how this works. We just know that it does help some people, rather than say, oh, you've got this faulty synapse in your brain. We think maybe that kind of stuff. And I think just not acting like the expert all the time and maintaining that curiosity and about people as individuals. So I think going back to the diagnosis stuff, that's a way that really shuts down exploring people's lives and what's happened to them, because you've got this word and you can put all of this preconception onto it, that you know how to deal with this person because they've got this label attached to them, and this is the medication that goes with this label, and this is the medication that goes with that label. I think there's the worst conversations I have and have had are more about kind of adherence, or compliance is the word they like to say. Are they compliant with the medication? Which for me is like, that's just a really disempowering notion and way of thinking about it, because compliance is synonymous with obedience, and that just brings up all kinds of problems.
I mean, in sometimes in medical school, we try to move a little bit beyond that to concordance. I don't know if that's a better kind of term, where we're actually coming to some kind of agreement together. But I love what you said here about maintaining curiosity and about people as individuals. I think that's so important, and about the risk of shutting down people's lives. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful. Let's have a look. So, oh, that's lovely. Clive is saying that he would very much like to meet you, but you can look at that later. Where are we? Yes.
We have a couple of minutes left. So, you know, it's a pity again, we have to cut some of the questions short, but maybe a last question or a couple of questions if John manages to answer them quickly.
Okay, so a quick one from Huda. How do you get out of the cycle of illness after treatment? I don't know if that's an easy one to answer quickly.
Well, it's different for everyone. I think I've found it hard because I went quite a long time maintaining some stability, and then it wasn't that long ago that I kind of fell back into it all, and I thought like, oh, I'll be fine, I'll never have this again. And I've kind of had to go through it, do the kind of apology tours where I've let a bunch of people down and I have to go around and apologize to everyone and that sort of thing. But I think time is possibly the most, it's everyone's biggest resource, and it's not more true than with something like this. Just time goes a long way, and forgiving yourself.
Yeah. And maybe I can make this my last question. I'm sorry to all the people I haven't done justice to. There's so many more questions, but this is from Rebecca Graff saying, if I was to be around a family member, friend, anyone who's going through psychosis, I must admit it would be probably somewhat, scare and overwhelm me. What would be the best way to react for me? What could I do to make sure the person's safe and getting what they need, so that potentially I can avoid them being sectioned and treated in the ways you've been treated?
So I think, I've been through it on both sides. So I had a friend who went through something like this, so I was having to watch it from the other side, which was really difficult for me. I think if I could give one bit of advice, it would just be to kind of resist that want that kind of really human urge to want to make things better and like fix things and help in a way. And because often I think one of the best things you can do is just be with them, not trying to help them, just help them know that there's someone there, not try and talk them out of certain things, just be with them. And it's really hard to do, and you need to keep yourself sane and all that as well.
That's really wonderful bit of advice, and something I've been talking about in medical education, just in general with our patients, you know, that it's not all about fixing, but actually about trying to be present. Sometimes it's kind of being the person who's witnessing the suffering. It's about being, you know, not running away into trying to treat and diagnose. Sometimes it needs, you know, the human touch basically, and that being there.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it just kind of it's about managing your own anxieties as the person there, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
John, thank you very much. And thank you, Louise, for facilitating the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.